Hello everyone and welcome to today's Australian Society of Archivists webinar, In Conversation with David Fricker. To begin, the Australian Society of Archivists acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from across Australia and the surrounding seas and recognise their continuing connection to land, water, culture and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present. We honour your local community traditions of caring for archives and culture, through country, through songs and stories. Today, I pay particular respect to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, whose land I'm joining from today. I just want to let everyone know this webinar is being recorded. You can ask questions through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Questions will only be visible to others once we've answered them. And as questions come through, I will try and incorporate them into our conversation today. Any non-anonymous questions we don't get to will be followed up by Stephen and David after the webinar. So today I'm joined by Director General of the National Archives of Australia, David Fricker, and joining us for part of the discussion is Stephen Fox, the Assistant Director General for Collection Management at the National Archives. So welcome David and Stephen to this ASA webinar and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, it's really good. Good to be with you today, Nicola.
Thanks, Nicola.
So we're hoping to cover a variety of topics, including a reflection on David's time as Director General of the National Archives. But most importantly, we are here to discuss what the NAA is currently doing and hearing an NAA response to the ASA statement on the move of South Australian cultural heritage to Canberra. And this clearly came through in the member questions. So that's where I'd like to begin. The ASA made this statement to raise our concerns on the move of NAA records from South Australia to Canberra. The key actions we called for in the statement are for priority listing of all South Australian records before being moved and a commitment to ongoing and free digitisation on-demand services. We also wanted to see an investigation into options for returning archives related to South Australia to the state. So since the ASA made this statement, we know that this equally applies to the records in Tasmania, with the majority of records the NAA currently holds there also being moved from the state. So these concerns have stemmed from the fact that previously moved records were never described and listed, and therefore more than 20 years on, people still can't request these items for digitisation. Equally, the items that have been left in the NAA's state-based repositories were previously left there due to their importance to that state, and that includes the pre-Federation records. So I think before we go any further, I want to invite you both to give a response to our ASA statement, and then we'll follow up with questions as appropriate. Thank you.
All right, look, thanks, Nicola. And can I also commence by saying I'm speaking to everybody from Canberra today, which is the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. And so can I also, in the language of Ngambri, just say Najin Jamali, Ngambri, Ngunnawal, Majigang Yanyibu Njandu, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend my respects to all First Nations people joining us today or indeed watching the recording. And look, and thanks Nicola as well, and thanks to the ASA for setting up this platform today to have a pretty free-ranging discussion about these very important issues and inviting us to give an account of what we're doing at the archives on this. So look, just to cut to the chase then, what the reason that we're going through this process of digitisation at the moment is related to the very, very welcome announcement of additional funding for the National Archives earlier this year. You know, it was a lifeline that was thrown to us to allow us to resume operating with some financial sustainability across all functions of the archives, which of course includes preservation and maintaining access to the precious archival resources in our care. And that funding was contingent on a number of recommendations that were made by David Tune when he did his very thorough functional efficiency review of the National Archives. So David Tune looked at all of the operations of the archives, and based on that, he made 20 recommendations. Based on that, we did receive that funding. And one of the recommendations in particular that David looked at was our state and territory operations. And he observed, and this was supported by submissions, that the National Archives is the only Commonwealth collecting institution that still has officers, you know, human beings actually working in state and territory jurisdictions. and applauded that and also said that we should continue to actively look at how we are maintaining that operation in the most effective way for all the people that come to visit us and the information and the services they want from us at our points of presence around Australia, and also make sure that our operations there, including operations such as co-location, records management, were fit for purpose. And so the funding we received out of that $67.7 million includes, from government, includes a measure, it's the second measure out of 4 measures, for us to use that funding to consolidate collection storage and improve digitisation. And so there were quite specific things in there that came with that funding that we had. And why? So why is it that measure should be specified in there? And it's because we are the National Archives of Australia. And the reason that we are present in every state and territory jurisdiction is because that's where Australians live, all right? I'll say this over and over again. Most Australians do not live in Canberra. Some of the very best Australians live in Canberra. Let me add that very quickly. However, not everyone does. And so why are we therefore where we are? Why are we in every state and territory jurisdiction? And why is that such a strategic strength for the archives? And why is that improving service delivery to all Australians? And it's because when you visit us at any of those state and territory offices, you are visiting the National Archives of Australia. That's a portal into the collection that is this most valuable part of the documentary heritage of Australia. And so this is why we digitise records, so that when you come and visit us, you can access the records of the collection. And the more we digitise those records, the more we describe them, the more we make them freely available, and I say freely available, then the better will be the service level that we are delivering when you come to visit and speak to our reference officers, our archivists in the state and territory offices. So the reason we're doing this is because we spend a lot of money on storage, and I'll come back to this because it isn't just about cost cutting, all right? And I know people think all we ever do in the bureaucracy is look to save money, but there is an aspect to this. And the resources, if we digitize the records, then we can make a much better accessibility available to those records. So we're not shifting records out of repositories and taking them into a centralized repository just because it's some sort of overall efficiency measure. We're doing that because it's a necessary part of digitisation, and because a much better way to provide access to all Australians, no matter where you live, is to have records digitally available, properly described, and, can I say, freely available. So what we're doing is, as each of our repositories, as each of the lease arrangements on our repositories come up for review, we are looking at, well, rather than just automatically renewing the lease and continuing to do things the way we've always done it, because we only exist in the analog world, we're saying, is there a better way to activate those records? Is there a better way to make those records discoverable, accessible, and engaging than to leave them in that repository and wait for someone to go where the repository is, and to privilege the people that live close to a repository? Or should we digitize them and make them freely available? And so that's what this is about. It's about to fulfill the requirements of that budgetary measure we have to consolidate but digitize our collection. And it's all about access. It's all about public service and access, because we're not closing any offices, and we're not diminishing any of the resourcing, the human resources we have in our offices. But we are, instead of being in a particular location because we're facing, turning away from the public, and we're in the repository preserving records, we're in each state and territory office because we're looking outward at the public, and we're all about public service. We're all about people coming in, providing advice, and making the records accessible. So this is what's happening with the South Australian records. Is the first case, because that's the first lease that has come up for review. And so we are now setting about digitising those records. And a part of digitisation means moving the records where we can use an industrial scale digitisation capability. And Nicola, if I could bring Stephen into the conversation, as you said in the introduction, Stephen is known to many ASA members, of course, already, but Stephen is in charge of our collection management branch, in charge of our whole state and territory network and our digitisation operations. And so I wonder if I might just get Stephen to talk about some tin tacks, because we do want to get into detail today, talk about some tin tacks about what's happening in South Australia and beyond in Tasmania, etc. And also just reaffirm that commitment to public service. So if that's all right with you, Nicola, if I can ask Stephen to jump into the conversation.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Nicola. Yeah, so look, just to continue on in terms of the digitisation space, I mean, as David said, we've received the funding, the $67.7 million in funding, and a key element of that is about digitisation, as David said. So just quite recently, in the last couple of weeks, we've signed a contract with an industry partner to move on-site into our facility here in Mitchell and Sanford Street, in a sort of a vacated part of the building, to operate, as David said, that industrial scale digitisation. So they'll be moving in. In fact, they're moving in right now. They'll start digitising in January. And so that is really about scaling up that digitisation capability. But it's fundamentally about access. It's fundamentally about digitisation for preservation and access. So the access, we mustn't forget the access side of the equation here. And the records that they will be focusing on initially in the digitisation hub will be the South Australian records that have moved to Canberra, as well as the Tasmanian records that will be moving to Canberra in January. So I think, what we're talking about in that space too is, a rapid turnaround of digitisation proactively and loaded up into record search and therefore available for free. But the other element that's really important to talk about, which one of the other measures, the second measure, is about building capability internally in the National Archives. And that's about creating a free digitisation on demand service. So currently it's a service we charge for. So what we're moving to, or we're certainly piloting with this record relocation, is a free digitisation on demand service. And so we're building that capability, or in fact, we built that capability in-house, and that free digitisation button effectively comes on in January. And so the records that have been relocated to the South Australian records that have been relocated to Canberra will be proactively digitised through the digitisation hub, and other records such as immigration records, those name-based records, will be available through free digitisation on demand. In terms of the specific records identified in the statement, I thought it might be useful for members just to sort of, there were some, records relating to some of the pre-Federation South Australian records. So just in terms of a little bit more detail, I mean, the records identified in the statement are all the focus of the proactive digitisation on demand space. I think it's also important there's a couple of things I'd like to acknowledge here. The work of the South Australian team, so Nick, Emily, Kelly, and Jeff is over there as well, and Diane. They've been working really hard in this space in terms of description, so that we've got the records described before they move, but also consulting through the consultative forum about what does the consulting forum think in terms of what are the priorities for digitisation, what should we focus on. And the message that strongly came through was we should be thinking about, when we're talking about the records that are important, significance, at risk, more fragile, large format plans, bound volumes, a lot of pre-Federation records in that list. And so just to get into the tin tacks, as David said, so Series D1051 is the main series of plans that are targeted for digitisation. As I said, that starts in January. So that includes post office plans from, the mid-1800s onwards that cover not only Adelaide, but regional South Australia as well. There's over 200 plans that relate to Torrens Island. So they're in the list to be prioritised for digitisation. And there's also volumes and bound volumes relating to Torrens Island that are also be in that first tranche of records to be proactively digitised. There's meteorological records, and of course, that's very topical at the moment. All our meteorological, it's hard to say, records across our collection are the focus of attention. And the South Australian records begin from the 1840s, so their priority to be proactively digitised. And lighthouse logbooks, we know that they're a focus of interest as well. So Cape Willoughby and Cape Jaffa, they're celebrating 150th anniversaries. So they're top priorities for digitisation as well in terms of that proactive space. And look, I just wanted to reiterate too, the point that David made is that we're not closing state and territory offices. This is about looking at the repository space as well, and that we really are talking about proactive, a two-pronged approach: proactive digitisation and the free digitisation on demand service. And that will apply to the Tasmanian records when they move. They're moving in early January. And again, we've been working with the Consultative Forum and the team down there. Bruce, Christina, and the rest of the team have been working on description and identifying the priority records that we should be proactively digitising. And again, no surprises, it's those large, awkward, hard to handle documents, bound volumes, that we'll be focusing on in the proactive digitisation space through the Digitisation Hub. So the new Digitisation Hub is going to be busy. We're really excited about it. I think it's like we've signed the contract now. We can say it's a micro image from Melbourne, and they're very excited too to be partnering with us. And it really is a partnership. We're working together to get work packages through this sort of industrial scale digitisation. So it's not about a queue so much as actually making sure everyone's efficient with how we get our large format documents through. They'll then be provided to us once they're digitised. Normal QC processes will apply, and then up onto record search they go. So many thousands of records many more will be available to researchers, not only in South Australia and Tasmania, but of course around Australia.
Thanks, Barry. I think we can all safely say that we're really happy that more records will be digitised and available online. I think that's a really positive thing to come from this. I think one of our critical concerns, I guess, is the location of the physical records post-digitisation. Like from my perspective, I think place when it comes to archival records is really powerful, and you can digitize and make records available online, which is fantastic for the access, but you can also repatriate digital copies, and we know that is not the same thing as repatriating a physical copy and the original item. So I think the tangible physical record and where it's located is different and will always be important. So I guess I'm not questioning the digitization aspect. I'm asking around why the records can't be returned to the state-based repositories post the digitization so that they remain accessible to those who they, particularly with those pre-federation records, they mean the most to, I guess. I feel like I'm going to say, David, you're on mute.
You're on mute, yeah.
The mute gods are working. So look, it's there is still consideration too, if you like, and I will use the word iconic, but all records are iconic. When you're at the National Archives, everything has already been selected as a national archival record. So there will always be a volume of records that will be held locally, in analog form locally, because of the value of the artifact, if you like. And so I think that's why when we talk about repatriation, we do have to be a bit sort of wary and open-eyed about when we say repatriation. What does that mean in the Commonwealth of Australia? What does that mean to the Federation? What does that mean for a Commonwealth record? So repatriation, I think we can consider a small volume of records that are being held at a particular place, say in South Australia or in Tasmania or in Queensland. But, earlier on I said, most Australians don't live in Canberra. Probably most South Australians don't live in Adelaide either, for example. There are South Australians all over the world who would also like to access their cultural heritage, and in particular those records of relevance to their place in South Australia. And there is always going to be a trade-off between how can we perform that primary function of access, and to what extent do we need to, as Stephen's just saying, to shift records so that we can maintain and sustain a free level of access to all South Australians, or indeed all Queenslanders who are interested in Commonwealth records created in South Australia. So I think I'll just be very careful and measured about, putting too much stake as archivists, can I say, in the sort of the value of repatriation. Now there are, as I say, there are considerations being made to those particular records that we are going to leave in South Australia. There's a whole discussion we're having around records of Indigenous Australians, because, we all of us appreciate that a record about a First Nations Australian, we have to be carefully considerate about what does that mean and what is that as an artifact and where should that be. And even then, whether it's in Darwin or Alice Springs or it needs to be on country somewhere. So we are having active discussions about that. But at some point, and as professional archivists, we have to consider, is the value we're creating, privileging people that live close to where a physical document is kept, is that really is that our code of ethics to privilege those people? Or as archivists, are we all about making sure that primary sources are discoverable, properly described and readily available as a universal right of access? Okay, so this is my sort of decision point. I have an obligation for a universal right of access to the archival resources of the Commonwealth. And so that's the balance. Can I ask, because Stephen, are you able just to comment on the decisions that have been made through the consultative forum and others,
Sure.
about stuff that will remain, for example, in South Australia?
Yep. So there's about 150 shelf metres, I think maybe 170 shelf metres remaining in South Australia, in Adelaide. And that's primarily records related to royal commissions and Aboriginal death in custody, because there's an agreement that those records stay in states. There's also some records still to be described. So I've just seen some comments through descriptions, so I'll touch on that as well. So there's some photographiing series which the South Australian team are working on describing. They'll then be digitised and then up on record search as well. So they're staying in Adelaide to be digitised. In Tasmania, there's around about 400 metres of records that are being retained. And quickly going to refer to my notes there. They relate to, again, meteorological records, meteorology records, Antarctic Division records, CSIRO records as well. There's a lot of CSIRO material down there that's significant. And again, that work is being described and digitised by the Tasmanian team down there as well. So that there actually is a focus on description. Now, obviously, in terms with regard to the material that's previously moved from South Australia, what I would say is that the material that's actually moving from South Australia now is at around about 93 to 94% described. So, and that is thanks, as I said, to the hard work of the South Australian team in doing that description work over many years, not just now, but over many years. And with regard to the Sydney material, it's, we acknowledge that that's an area that has to be dealt to. We just, and it's available on our website, we've just put out our next national description strategy. And some of the, it's an ambitious strategy, but we're talking about describing 1.7 million items each financial year to 2024. And part of the work that is happening, it's about to happen actually in the new year, is the consultation with across the national network of our offices and consultative forum to identify those, again, priority areas for description. So it may be that, often the bankruptcy records that got transferred in 2000 have come up. And so maybe that's a priority focus for description for the team, for description to happen across, the national network. So it's certainly the other space in terms of description is how we use and explore new technologies to help with that task. Because again, we're talking about a vast collection. What is there in the machine learning and artificial intelligence space, for example, that can help us, upscale as much as we're upscaling digitisation? How do we upscale the description functions as well, as of course using volunteers through our archive portal. That's an important element of describing. And during lockdowns, of course, this year we've using our own team that have been locked out of the offices, they've been working flat out in description space as well. So we're making some good inroads. But it's not underestimating. It is a big task to be done.
Yeah, I think that's come through in a couple of questions I had before, and I kind of see one now, is around the digitization and the kind of timeframes we're looking at. So people are asking, all the records that are being planned for moving out of South Australia and Tasmania, are they all going to be digitized? And how long is the plan? Like, how long is that going to take? And I think tied into that, some of the questions we had before is, can you talk more about your plans to not only digitize, but really fully describe and index the records that are being moved? Because until that happens, they're not very accessible realistically. And yet people are wondering how long that process itself is going to take as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. Well, just in terms of the descriptions, I'll take that one first. So the percentages that I've been quoting are item level descriptions. So obviously series are described, so we know where everything is, but this is about item level description. So the existing South Australian records that have moved and the Tasmanian collections are well described. And then as David mentioned, that the next focus is the Northern Territory repository. That's the next lease that's up. So there's work happening. We're about to deploy some staff to add into that team, start focusing on description there. And of course, consultation we've started the consultation process with not only our consulting forum, but with our Aboriginal advisory group as well, in terms of what are the records that are most sensitive, what needs to be described, what could be prioritised for digitisation. I guess what we're saying is it's not a one size fits all. I think as we approach each state office, there are unique elements that will apply to each of those areas that we're considering through the process. In terms of the digitisation, no, we're not digitising everything that's moving. Let's be clear. The items we're selecting for proactive digitisation really are what we would consider to be paper records at risk. And age is not a determinant of significance, but it's often a determinant of fragility around the records. And they're not the sort of things we want to keep pulling out and being handled either. So, it's proactive digitisation, but it's proactive preservation as well. So certainly in that space, there's a lot of that large format bound volumes, all those colonial records will be digitised. The material that won't be falls into the free digitisation on demand category. So it is things like immigration case files, those names, sort of name, single research sort of objective space. That's in the free digitisation on demand space. So I guess that's part of the two-pronged approach, recognising that we can never digitise everything, but to be strategic with our proactive digitisation, it really is focusing on those up until recently, there are plans that are sitting in plan drawers that are accessible only if you come, as David said, if you physically turn up between 9 and 5, 3 days a week, you can see them. Through this approach, the items are digitised, preserved for that digitisation, they're accessible under that as well. We've signed the contract for 2 years for the Digitisation Hub, but we're expecting it to continue on. And so we're anticipating, we're still working through with Microimage the exact work packages, so it's a bit hard to say we'll have X done by X date. But suffice to say that this is really a significant upscaling of digitisation for the National Archives and for those records, both Tasmanian and South Australian are priority records that will go through the Digitisation Hub.
So we did just get another question following on from that. Is how long is the free digitisation on demand plan to last for material that isn't otherwise digitised as part of the plan?
Well, the plan is in perpetuity. This is why this is why we are going through the pain, if you like, the disruption now for the holy grail here is free access. As I was saying, that universal right of access, but I've always said I never want to have a paywall between public records and the public. But at the moment we have to levy a fee because it's the only way we can provide that service. So the intention here is we're on the journey towards free access in perpetuity of a public record. There's a very persuasive argument that says every government record in our collection has already been paid for by the taxpayer. None of those records were created for free. So as Australians, we've already paid for the record. We have legislation that entitles us to access it. And our democracy depends on transparency and openness. And, we are constantly pushing that envelope as hard as we can, more transparency, more integrity of Australian government. So unequivocally, you know, the plan is for it to be in perpetuity. Now we're doing it one step at a time, because there's always going to be, you know, a budget. You know, we get an appropriation and we shift costs, you know, from one activity to another. And if we can shift costs from repository rent to digitisation stuff, that's great, because that's the free service that we can continue to provide. Stephen's just gone through it with the balance of proactive digitisation to, in advance, you know, get that stuff ready to go and then do the rest on demand. So we're then digitising the records that people want at the time. That's a more sustainable model. It'll still cost money to digitise, but that by doing it that way, we've got every prospect of it being a free service into the future. But we have to start here to prove that can work. You know, we have to start doing this. We have to take some steps to actually prototype that business model, those functions, to then see what the level of demand is, you know, because at the moment, based on the demand we currently have and the level of access that is currently available by people visiting a research centre and waiting for it to come out of the repository, we can easily meet that level of demand. Now, by providing, you know, digitised on-demand service, the demand may skyrocket, you know, may increase tenfold. So let's see how that goes and how we can manage those levels of service. But I can guarantee that the current level of service will be sustained easily with a free model. And I'm very optimistic that we can then continue to increase that.
And can I just add a couple of things? Sorry, Nicola, just jump in there. You know, this is part of that digital transformation that is happening everywhere. It's not just archives. This is happening across the board. The expectations of users, customers, clients, audience, whatever you want to call them, is changing, and it's changing fast. And, you know, 365 days a year, 24/7, you know, access is, you know, it's what people expect. So we've got to find that sweet spot there. And I think the other thing that's important to recognise too is that we're talking about physical records here, but we're now taking digital records in. You know, we're taking digital transfers into the National Archives, and there will be a day when there is no physical record; it's a digital record. So this is almost setting up that space, you know, and just to jump in and address other issues that have been raised around, or what are staff going to do now if there's no repository? There is so much more information that is now available there. If anything, we're going to need more people to be interfacing, to be helping researchers, to helping public, helping community in terms of navigate that space with this richness of content and records that are going to be available digitally. I get very excited because I think it's really exciting, because it really is opening up access to the archives that previously have not been as accessible. So I think it's I'll stop there. I'll get too excited.
I'm expecting to see a lot more in record search then moving forward that people can request. I think though, talking, you just mentioned around communities and providing more access and stuff, and I see we have a question for David, which is around, well, you're talking about the importance of digital rights of access. Could you comment on the decommissioning of the forced adoption website, which happened with no notice to the community recently?
Yeah, look, we were so proud to do that forced adoption initiative. You know, I was very proud actually to be at the National Archives, because when that is the result, as we know, of a parliamentary inquiry and one of the recommendations, and none of that material was in the collection of the National Archives. But when Parliament sort of cast around to all of the memory institutions that might be capable of implementing that recommendation to show Australians the truth, you know, to truth telling, I suppose, to actually seriously engage in truth telling about a traumatic national experience, and to bring other Australians, you know, some appreciation of that traumatic experience, it was us. You know, we were the only ones that could do it. So it was not, you know, as I say, it's not an exhibition of National Archival material. That is a public, I can't even call it a public program. It is a serious part of Australia's, truth telling. And so very, very pleased and very proud of the work that was done there. Our staff did a fantastic job in dealing with the issues. And I think we had some very, very positive results through that public engagement. But it's not, and then the reason it's come to an end is because it came to an end. You know, it was a government initiative. It was funded, you know, that there is no ongoing appropriation for that outcome of that parliamentary inquiry. It came with a finite sum of money and a finite requirement from the government. We exceeded by far the initial scope of what was required of us or asked of us to do. We far exceeded that. And again, I'm very proud of that. But it's you know, we can't, you know, these things require ongoing resources, like substantial, significant resources to do it justice, that whole topic. Lots of product were created out of that with the goodwill and the contributions of all those people affected. And that material and all those resources are still in existence. But it's not something that the archives can continue to do. You know, it requires funding. So as I say, rather than sort of feel like, you know, suddenly we turn that off without notice, we exceeded. And again, I'm very proud of the fact we far exceeded the scope of the task that was given to us. And I'm just pleased. And I think as archivists, as a profession, I think this is one of the things we do well. Because we can return to primary sources and we can produce things, not because we're trying to glorify, you know, an episode of our past or whatever. We can just put honest record documentary evidence in front of Australia and engage in some genuine truth telling. But it had a start date and it had an end date, and I'm afraid that's, you know, that's now happened. But yeah, that's what I would say about that. Again, it was a great initiative and a great achievement, I think, of this institution.
I think it's really disappointing, obviously, that it isn't available any longer. And I think it is a sign of the kind of times, I guess, that we're in, that lots of things are project funded and only funded on short-term, timeframes, despite the fact that what is being achieved and the resulting outcome is something that should exist in perpetuity and should be available to everyone forever. So I think as the archival profession, that's something we need to get a lot better about. I think we should be supporting digital humanities projects and things in a better way to actually make sure they're accessible long term, because I do think that that's something we haven't done well and we aren't doing well, is making sure that those digital projects remain up.
Yeah, no, it is true. And it's sort of where archival resources, you know, are eventually turned into, you know, enduring resource, like whether it be it publications or be it ongoing institutions of their own or whatever. You know, we're part of the, again, you know, we're providing those primary sources. This activity was, of course, a level of interpretation and curation, but it was very honest, you know, like really honest and robust curation of that material. And as I repeat, they weren't archival resources from the National Archives of Australia, and that's quite significant in this discussion we're now having. So you're right, you know, at some point though, that should become a permanent piece of Australia's documentary heritage, and maybe other sort of institutions as well. So look, I can but agree, Nicola. But look, in as much as that can happen, I am quite proud of the contribution we have made to date, because it was tough. You know, the staff, I'll stop talking because there are other questions, but that sort of work, and well, ASA talks about this quite a bit as well. It was one of those cases where mediating access to difficult records is very emotionally, you know, testing of archivists. And I think it is one of those things that we do. It's one of the valuable contributions we make as a profession, if I can say that. Thanks.
I agree. Given it's an area that I focus on, I think trauma-informed archival practice and providing access in a trauma-informed way is really critical. And part of that as an organisation is ensuring that you are supporting your staff to provide that access in a safe and empowering way for everyone. I'm just looking at the questions, sorry, just to make sure I cover other ones as well. We have, I think we've kind of touched on some of them. So talking, I guess, on a different topic, we have a question around the palace letters. As archivists, do we need to reflect on how access decisions for records of the past can affect how and what records are created in the future?
Yeah, we can. And how to tie that in with the palace letters, I suppose. It's sort of because they're two sort of different things. The look, I think, yeah, I guess what's coming up behind that question is, why was it so hard to see the palace letters? And then, now that they're out, is that going to help us make better decisions in the future? So it was so hard to see those palace letters because of a legislation issue. And I know people get sick of hearing me say this because they sort of see me as this demon in Canberra who was, saying, no, you're not worthy enough to see these records. And it was my personal capricious decision to keep them back. But again, that whole legal argument was an argument over the legal definition of the word property. Whose property are these records? And therefore, what was the compact that the archives had entered into, and how should we fulfill that? And as archivists, again, as part of our code of ethics, if we accept the deposit of records, then we should be prepared to fulfill our commitments that we make. Because if you don't, sources will dry up. No one will deposit records in archives if they think, well, fine, you've said that they should remain closed until you die, or they should remain closed for 20 years. But you know what? I've found a historian here that wants them tomorrow. I'm going to give them all to this person. We need to fulfill our commitments. But what eventually led to their release was the High Court interpreted the legislation. So the first part of the answer is we need clear legislation that makes it absolutely beyond doubt about what is and what isn't a public record, and legislation that empowers institutions like ours to actually go ahead and either accession those records and then make them accessible, because our current legislation falls short in those areas, which is why I was thinking the other day was a conversation about when lawyers argue with each other. And I was thinking there's a difference between when archivists have argument, like we have this discussion, and there's a difference between an archivist discussion and a lawyer's discussion. And that difference is about $1.6 million. And I don't want to do that again. So we do need better legislation. And the other thing is about records being created now. It's true that it is a worry. It concerns me that the 20-year rule now as opposed to the 30-year rule, these ambiguities and these legal disputes about what should be public and what shouldn't can have a chilling effect on public servants in office today or ministerial officers, and has a chilling effect on the records that are being created. What is not being recorded, really important decisions, activities of government are not being properly recorded, or people are using practices to evade the creation of a record. And so I think on that front, it is always a problem that we have thinking about the future. Are we properly documenting Australia today? Are we keeping and preserving the essential evidence of government today? And I think on both fronts, we need much, much stronger legislation.
I agree. It'd be wonderful to see the Archives Act being updated making it more appropriate for the times that we live in now, I think.
Yeah.
Going back to a question that maybe Stephen might be interested in answering, I'm not sure. I see a question around how is the film and AV digitisation going in Sydney?
Yep.
Sure, thanks, Nicola. I'm happy to take that one. As I mentioned in the new funding measures, the first measure is about outsourced digitisation. So part of that funding, well, actually, to be honest, the large quantity of that funding is actually going towards digitising our magnetic tape records at risk. So, and the funding provided which is very pleasing, will allow us to digitise and through that digitisation preserve all our magnetic tape record risks that are currently in our collection. This doesn't include anything still out in agency land that has to be transferred. This is just what we hold. And so we're just on the verge of, I think we've just started to move some of those records to our industry partners to start digitising. Again, this is bulk digitisation of those magnetic tape records at risk. And so that is happening through our AV preservation team in Sydney and supported by our team here in Canberra. There is also a small allocation to film digitisation. So the magnetic tape records are the highest at risk of loss. So that's why we're targeting those records at risk. But we also acknowledge there are some small amounts of film that we need to focus on. So there is a small allocation across the 3.5 or the 4 years of funding to digitise film records at risk, predominantly acetate vinegar syndrome film. That's most at risk in that category. So that work is happening as well. It's not just about paper records and those things. It is other records at risk that we're targeting.
Excellent. And the other questions that we have at the moment are back to our original topic, I guess, and they're really questioning that it's not just me, you see, asking these questions. The question remains, why can't the records be returned once they've been digitized? You're able to provide universal access once this occurs, so why are you holding on to them?
Well, look, if I can jump in, our commitment is to preserve the record. So if we've decided that the originals are worth preserving, then I've got to follow through on that commitment. Well, sorry, the National Archives has to follow through on that commitment to preserving. So what, it's more than just kind of an emotional response to say, I can sleep at night knowing that these records are at this particular street address. They've got to be preserved. They have to be in proper conditions, with proper security, with proper, temperature controls, humidity controls, etc. And we can't, if we can't do both. We can't have these records made widely and freely available and assume those costs of doing that and engage in that ongoing active program, and then also carry the additional costs of having proper preservation facilities, and then who's that for? Who exactly are we responding to say those records are going to be held at that street address, wherever it is, because again, these are South Australian records, or they're Australian records, however you want to do it. So, for us to commit to a level of service and commit to an ongoing preservation, we have to make sure that we are, in the most cost-effective way, doing both, providing universal access and guaranteed preservation of the records. And that, in the real world that I operate in with a finite budget, we have to consolidate that. We have to consolidate onto a finite number of repositories that are secure, that have got the right temperature and the right humidity, the right level of staffing to inspect them, et cetera, et cetera. So they're still available, they're still there, and people can still sleep at night knowing these records are there, but they might not be at that street address. Now, and I say again, we had the earlier discussion about recognising there are some records which are in a special category, and Stephen's done a good job explaining that. But I don't know, Stephen, is there more to add to that response?
No, I don't think so. I'm conscious there's only 10 minutes left, and that's a minute a year that you've got to reflect on, David. But no, I think, look, the repository conditions vary around the country, and so we do have to think about, when we're making those assessments about the best conditions, as you say, long-term preservation conditions for the record, that is fundamental to the decision-making process. So, it is about that, that's a key factor in there. But it is about, I'll say it again, it is about what happens to those records is about preservation through digitisation and access through digitisation as well. I think we have to keep that top of mind as well.
Yes, well, hopefully the records being left in your state-based repositories are also receiving the wonderful climate control and good
right. Well, that's
quality
yes.
that is being held otherwise. I did just see this question come through, and I think given, David, I know you had a big role in the ICA being willing to support the Tanzania Adelaide Declaration. I think it's a good one to ask of you. And it's around, what do you feel the NAA's role or responsibility as a national government institution in healing Indigenous pasts? Free access is great for this, but they still feel like many Indigenous people, not just those in special records that are being kept on site, would argue that Indigenous knowledge and stories are most meaningful on country and can best be responded to on country. So where is the line between proper preservation and a commitment to healing?
Yeah, look, yes, fantastic question, and it's it's something that we are exploring and discovering. And I'm saying this, I mean, full well, I'm a non-Indigenous, privileged, white man speaking here, but it is something that we are absolutely 100% committed to discovering, what is the right way to do that. I think I think all ASA members would know Phyllis Williams, who is senior member of our staff, but she is also in charge of our ASA strategy. She's the principal author of our ASA protocols that we've just, recently released, which goes to those very issues. It's recognising, moral, our moral obligation. It's recognising ownership of cultural knowledge. It's recognising proper agency. We talked about legislation before. Archival legislation is a very Westminster kind of colonial legislation. A record is either publicly available or it's not. Well, that doesn't work when you're talking about First Nations records. So how do we manage and broker proper access? All sorts of strata within First Nations communities, who should have access and under what circumstances, how should records be handled, etc. And as we said before, if a record has that physical value, tangible physical value, well, then its place does need to be respected. So I'm not going to recite any particular patter here. What I'm giving it to everyone is a commitment that this institution takes it very seriously. It's an admission from me that we don't have all the answers today, but we are committed to walking that path and doing it. And Tandanya and the event that we did convene with ASA and ICA was a genuine commitment to doing that. And I think we've got the right people on it. We have started working. I think at the ASA conference, I think it was Rose Barracliff who had a really interesting case study of trying to find herself, her people, her nation in the archives, and all the place names were wrong. There were hardly any references. That's the sort of thing that we are also very engaged in. Like QSA, we're also very engaged in saying, well, no, we should be, the description, the metadata that we're accumulating should reflect those names of country, those proper names, and we should be handling and providing access in respectful ways. And anyway, I'm just talking in circles now, Nicola, but it's very serious. We do have a role as the National Archives of Australia, not only to the National Archives, but the First Nations that, we now consider within Australia. So it's trying to do that in a very respectful, inclusive way, but it's not going to be rushed. There's a lot of talking and a lot of listening required to be done here, and we're committed to doing that. And here I really do commend Phyllis Williams is leading us on that front, and she's doing a great job.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's an area that we all have a lot of work to do in as well, not just the National Archives, but I think the archival profession, I think most archival institutions have work to do in this area. And I am very conscious of the time. I've left very little time for a nice little reflection from David. But I'll give you the chance. It's all right. I feel like if people need to leave, you can leave, and we'll finish up very soon. But I did just want to say that obviously you've been Director General of the National Archives for 10 years. I think we all learn, grow, change in that time. 10 years is quite a long time. I think the archival profession has changed quite a lot in that time as well. So I'm curious just to hear how you found the archival profession. I guess you weren't in it before you turned up at the National Archives. So yeah, just a little bit around what you've learned from joining the profession, and maybe what your kind of key takeaway is.
Well, now people will start leaving once I start, blubbering on about this. Look, you're right, Nicola. When I came into this job, I came to it from quite a different, profession, sort of about information sciences and information management and intelligence and the use of information for strategic sort of purposes. And so at that level, it was a very natural progression, to come to the archives. But what I've learned is a lot of what we've been discussing today. And this last year, actually, the publicity and the public media discussion, the national conversation that was the National Archives, I think says it all for me, that it was so much more than the National Archives is so much more than a sterile collection of bureaucratic documents. It's about the life of people. You know, it's about the individuals, the unheard voices of everyday Australians and the way that they have interacted with government, but the way they've interacted with each other across the nation. And what I have really been impressed by, and, you know, we just talked about the First Nations, you know, records about First Nations Australians. And this is something like people like Sue McCamish, you know, have really hammered home, you know, this message as well over my time here. That all of our conversations these days, I think, seem to be more about the humanities, you know, the big problems facing humanity, whether it's human rights, whether it's, you know, inclusivity of society, it's you know, countering inequality, it's fighting against corruption, or it's just empowering people with enough agency to have their voice in a liberal democracy like Australia. And so for me, it's those really high-level aspirational you know, ambitions that we all have as archivists, and I do call myself an archivist now. I wasn't allowed to 10 years ago, but I certainly do now, because it is much more than description and arrangement. You know, it is of course, it needs all of those things: description, arrangement, preservation. We must have that. But I think what we have, certainly in Australia and across the ASA and across the ICA, is a much higher level, a much higher level understanding of why we do what we do. And the fact that we're not government agencies so much as institutions, that we really, our role is to survive cycles of politics, you know, the ups and downs of politics and all this sort of stuff. And we are very much that intergenerational memory. You know, we're the things that keep a nation as stable as it possibly could be, and that keeps a nation in touch with who it is, you know, where we've come from, what's the ugly past that we've got, what's the beautiful past that we've got, you know, what are the battles that people have fought, and so that we can face some sort of more optimistic future based on the information we have. So for me, that's really my reflection, is that this has been so much more than a job here. It really has been just such a privileged insight to you know, what we are as a nation and the millions of people that make us up, and the role that we have as archivists. You know, we genuinely are transmitting the memory of that. You know, we're the way that the voices of the dead can be heard by the unborn. You know, it's as fantastic as that. So that's it for me. That's what I've taken away from this.
I'm glad we had such an impact on you as a professional.
I remember talking to you one day about how you were going to change the world. Well, you certainly changed me, Nicola. And look, actually, we have run out of time, but I can't stop without thanking you, by the way, and the ASA for this today. But I think the fantastic work that the ASA does, because I really do think ASA does do a lot of what we've just been talking about. It moves our consciousness. You know, anyway, you've done a wonderful job in sort of elevating the role of archives in contemporary Australian society. So well done, you.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting that, but thank you. It's very kind. And I do appreciate that I have been the bolshy archivist who has challenged you on a lot of points over the years that we have known each other. And I appreciate that you have listened to me sometimes.
All time, always.
But to conclude, my final question is, I have to ask, what are your future projects? What do you plan to do once you're free from full-time work? Or perhaps most importantly for me, what volunteer role are you going to think of signing up for the ASA?
Oh, well, I'm still very occupied with the ICA, so I remain the president of the ICA until September. So hopefully we'll see everybody in Rome at our next annual conference in September. So that'll keep me occupied. Look, Memory of the World as well, UNESCO Memory of the World. I'm still heavily engaged with that, and I really look forward to spending more time on some of those issues as we've now reinvigorated the Memory of the World program, the International Register. And I hope I won't be excommunicated, my membership of the ASA, so you never know. You might see this grumpy, dishevelled figure up the back of the next ASA conference, and it might just be me. So I hope to stay engaged.
I'm sure we can find you something to do. There's always lots to be done.
Okay.
But I do want to thank you so much for joining me today, and to Stephen as well, for taking time out to really talk through that critical issue of the move of the NAA records. I think it was really great to have you both being really open and transparent about what is happening, to hear more broadly, responding to members' questions, and yeah, those who've joined us today. So thank you so much. And we do really appreciate everything you've done as Director General of the National Archives. And of course, we await to see who will be replacing you as the new Director General moving forward. But thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us in the audience today. The ASA Lunchtime webinar series will come back next year. And so please check the website and join us as appropriate. Hope you have a wonderful break and an end to 2021, and I will see you all in 2022. Thank you so much.